Now I have the pleasure of introducing William Strauss and Annette Bossler, who will present on global and Asian markets. Bill, take it away.
Well, good morning, good evening to everyone that's attending this seminar today. Thank you very much for taking the time. I'm going to introduce the presentation here with a few slides about the global markets, and then Annette will focus on Japan, and then I'll finish off with just a few comments on South Korea. But first, let me just do a quick introduction of Future Metrics. That slide shows logos of many of our clients in recent years, and this PowerPoint will be viewed later so you can take a closer look. This is our key core team, and you can see Annette there and myself, as well as some others. Many of you will recognize John Swan. So with that, let's launch into the details of this. An overview of international wood pellet trade is how we're going to begin. First, however, let me remind everybody that the reason we're here and the reason this industry exists is to deal with carbon emissions reduction. We're fighting climate change. And this chart is produced by the actuaries, the people who actually price risk for insurance companies. And you can see that their climate risk index has increased dramatically in recent years and is on an upward trajectory. That means it's getting more and more expensive to insure against risks associated with climate change. This should drive business people. It doesn't even have to be an environmental reaction. It's a business reaction. Okay, so we know that it's climate change. We know it's carbon emissions. Let's take a look and see what the industry has been doing and where it may go in the future. And I just want to note that these next few slides are based on an article that was just put out today by Canadian Biomass on their website. So there's more detail in that article. You're welcome to go and browse through that. As I said a moment ago, climate change will drive policy this decade. And I think we're going to see more and more aggressive policies in order to decarbonize our heating and power sector. The heating sector is important. The industrial is another way of saying this, the use of pellets for the production of electricity, and in some cases, large scale combined heat and electricity, combined heat and power will be even more important. This chart shows you current demand and forecast demand for both heating pellets and industrial pellets. And you can see that by 2027, we're getting close to 55 million tons a year of wood pellets total. Now, this is under current policy. And in just a moment here, I'm going to talk a little bit about evolving policy, where I think, or we think, that the markets will go. Here's a breakdown of the heating market. And there's a lot of detail here. So later on, you can take a look at this presentation and look at the details. But you can see that over the past, 15 years or so, the heating market has grown at an average rate of about 1 million metric tons per year. You can also see that the largest users are Italy, Germany, and right at the top, the US. The US is a large consumer of heating pellets. The industrial sector, under current policy, is expected to reach about 27.5 million metric tons by 2027. But you can also see that growth flattens out quite dramatically next year or the year after, because pretty much policy has been fulfilled, or current policy has been fulfilled by conversions of coal-powered, coal-fueled power stations, and by the developments of independent power producers in Japan, and of course, co-firing in South Korea. So under current policy, we see growth flattening, but we don't think current policy is going to stick around. We think it's going to be evolving. We think Japan is likely to support co-firing and utility power boilers. The US, under the new Biden administration, is likely to support co-firing and utility power boilers in the US. In fact, recent news coming out from the Biden administration supports this strongly. So I think we'll see a whole new market developing in the United States. Canada is a real potential with a few new coal stations, particularly in Alberta, that would benefit from co-firing. Germany is another likely area, and then there are others. Chile, for example, is pursuing some policies that would allow pellets in power stations. So let's just suppose that under evolving policy, we see quite a difference from the first forecast. No longer a flattening in 2022 or 2023, we see continued increase. In fact, from 2010 to 2027, the average growth rate is about 2.25 million tons per year. And you'll see at the top of that chart, we have Japan, Canada, US, and Germany added to the mix. Or Japan is actually about double what it was in the previous slide. And if we look at the two together, we are now close to 70 million tons of heating pellet and industrial pellet demand by 2027. And this is being driven by policies that are going to be fighting climate change. It's the evolution of policy. Now I'm going to turn it over to Annette, who is going to discuss Japan more specifically. Annette?
Ohayo gozaimasu, annyeonghaseyo, and good evening from the beautiful coast of Maine. So I like to show some of the data from Japan. This is actually official data from Japanese Customs, published on a monthly basis by the Ministry of Finance in Japan. So what we have highlighted here is basically the import growth of PKS, so palm kernel shells, as well as wood pellets into Japan. And you can see that the data starts in 2009 for PKS. That is when PKS imports started into Japan. And then in 2012, that's when the first wood pellets get imported into Japan. So PKS continues to be a very important solid biomass fuel. But as you can also see, wood pellets, the demand and therefore the imports is steadily increasing. Between the two, probably the biggest difference is that PKS is purchased more at short term, while pellets are normally supplied at longer term offtake agreements. Having said that, many Vietnamese suppliers sell pellets into Japan, often at short notice and in smaller batches like 10,000 or 20,000 tons, which is also that the Vietnamese pellet industry is geared to because of their business with South Korea. As the Japanese government is looking at sustainability requirements, so for PKS, starting in April 22, PKS will be subject to sustainable requirement certification under the Green Gold label standards. And so that is going to be interesting then what that means for the continuous imports into Japan. This is data that shows basically the CIF cost per metric ton for both PKS and wood pellets. And you obviously see declining wood pellet price. That is pretty much driven by the imports for Vietnam into Japan, as we'll see on the next slide. The PKS prices by comparisons going up, and that is mostly due because the government in Indonesia levies export taxes on per metric ton on PKS, and that's often applied also very short notice. So here's the wood pellets imports by country into Japan, 2012 when it started to last year. So in 2020, we saw the continued growth of Vietnamese pellet imports into Japan, by now far outpacing Canada as the key supplier. And the reasons for that is obviously cost and it's also shipping distance. It remains to be seen, however, what Japanese government sustainability requirements, which are yet to be finalized for wood pellets, will mean for Vietnamese pellet imports, because as we all know, the sustainability of Vietnamese pellets can be, let's say, a bit in a gray area. So depending what the Japanese government decides, importers in Japan may sort of have potential reduced interest. But since we do not know yet what these sustainable requirements are going to be, it remains an interesting question. Also noteworthy on this slide is the slight growth of imports from Malaysia, Indonesia, as well as Australia. So if Indonesia and Malaysia keep growing their imports, that is competition for Vietnam, though you can argue that there are also some sustainability issues in those countries. And then Australia, there are, we see a number of growing new projects for pellet manufacturing, so that could longer term also be a growing supplier to Japan. So here's the average CIF price per metric ton per country, and it is in Japanese yen. I did not convert it because I didn't want exchange rate to, for example, US dollars sort of distort the picture here. So obviously you can see why Vietnam, which is the yellow line, has seen such growth, because there is a considerable lower price compared to, for example, Canadian pellets. So another important solid biomass fuel in Japan are wood chips, and not only imported wood chips, but also Japanese domestic wood chips. I mean, the Japanese forest sector is still quite small, but the government has been doing different policy measures to grow that sector, and there is a growing amount of wood chips being supplied also to biomass power plants. But this is the slide for imports. What we are doing, we are tracking obviously the total imported wood chips, but also what we know from the respective industry associations is being used by the paper industry as well as the particle board industries. So based on our calculations, we see that on average over the last few years, you have between 1 and 1.5 million metric tons of wood chips, imported wood chips, that are available for the biomass power industry. And based on our power plant database, there's quite a sizable portion of that is being used in biomass power plants. So it's unlikely that we'll see a big increase in this. As you can see, the numbers hold pretty steady, but in a way that is something the Japanese like, because it is a stable and constant fuel supply into Japan. So the ongoing sustainability discussions, what's happening here? I won't go into too much detail because we have two presentations coming up on this topic. I'd just like to point out a little bit of background. It's important to understand that there are actually two working groups on this topic. One obviously is the METI working group on biomass sustainability. The focus there is the sustainability criteria for biomass power generators that are that want to use the feed-in tariff. And also for new projects that want to use the new feed-in premium PPA scheme that is going to go into effect next year, and it's comparable to the UK's contract for difference scheme. The other important working group is a joint working group by METI and by the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries on forestry and woody biomass power generation and how this can be grown. And there's a big discussion about, the different types of biomass fuels. And if you look through the meeting minutes, you find that METI and MAF have different focus. The METI focus is obviously very much on cost reduction for biomass fuels to bring the power prices down. The MAF focus is more on growing the domestic forest sector, including woody biomass for heat. And if you look at the various notes, you can see there's quite a discussion going on. So as part of this, you obviously have stakeholder input. There's obviously key stakeholders are the power plant operators, who basically want manageable and cost-efficient sustainability requirements. You have the Japan domestic forest sector that are very cautious and concerned about what potential sustainability requirements for imported biomass might mean for Japan domestic biomass. So they have a very strong voice in these discussions as well. There's the paper industry. A lot of paper companies also run biomass power plants as well. So they have basically a double interest: wood chip supply for paper making, but also solid biomass fuels. And again, there is a quite carefully balanced input to the Japanese government with regard to sustainability requirements. And then you have, like in every country, you have sustainability activists who basically do not really want imported woody biomass to be used in Japan, but obviously had their discussion with the Japanese biomass sector. And basically, if you listen to some of their presentations or look at their website, Japanese domestic biomass is classified as the good biomass. So finally, I want to share a little bit about the overall power mix in Japan, because this is also what drives the biomass sector overall. So you see that renewables continue to grow, especially since 2012, but coal and LNG power plants still provide the majority of base load in Japan. Among renewables, hydropower and solar PV are by far the dominant renewable energy power sources. The fourth quarter 2020 statistics have not yet been published, but we assume that actually the LNG power mix is going to be smaller because there has been an LNG shortage in Japan, driven by high demand in China and South Korea, as well as cold weather that Japan has experienced over the last few months. And also, what as we in the biomass sector have to watch is the growing offshore wind power market in Japan. There's a project pipeline of over 10 gigawatts of offshore wind power that is very likely to be constructed and commissioned in the next 5 to 10 years. The power mix in Japan is very important, and that was highlighted just over the last few days when Japan had off the coast of Fukushima and Miyagi Prefecture a major earthquake, and basically 9.5 gigawatts of thermal power capacity of Tohoku Electric Power Company had to be taken offline, and some of it has not gone back online. So Tohoku Electric Power Company, at short notice, now has to buy LNG on the spot market. So the power mix and having options for natural disasters, for to weather events, everything is a very important focus of the Japanese government. And this is an aspect that also the biomass power sector should be very much aware of and potentially come up with strategies that can help to address these aspects. And on that note, back to you, Bill.
Thank you. Just a few quick comments on Korea, and then we will pause for Q&A. Just 3 slides. The sort of key takeaway is uncertainty. And this slide shows you the recent history of REC prices, renewable energy certificates, which are traded in the Korean markets. And as you can see, REC prices more or less collapsed over the last few years and have remained very low. Low REC prices translate into challenging revenue relationships with the co-firing power stations. And it doesn't look like it's going to change. This is just an excerpt from Argus from recently, and it mentions the current REC weighting, where domestic woody biomass gets 1.5 RECs per megawatt hour and imported wood pellets 0.5 RECs per megawatt hour. And we've seen in the past, and we're expecting again here in the near future, that South Korea will once again sort of recalibrate what the REC weightings are. So there continues to be uncertainty in that market. It's very difficult to for anybody, either on the buyer side or the producer side, to see long-term agreements of any type in that market. And here we can see that wood pellet demand over the last 5 years or so grew quite dramatically for a while, and then it's gone relatively flat in the last few years as REC prices have fallen. So we think it's very difficult to, well, it's difficult to forecast where South Korea is going to go, but it's also pretty much impossible to engage in long-term offtake agreements, at least under current policy. Policy, as I said earlier, for other jurisdictions, policy in South Korea may evolve as well. And with that, we'll stop and do questions and answers. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill and Annette, for that insightful presentation. We've got a couple questions already, so let's just get into that. First off, there's a lot of talk about future requirements for torrefied pellets in Japan. What's holding such pellets back, and what do you foresee?
Yeah, interesting question and timely. Future Metrics probably next week will be releasing a comprehensive study on torrefied technologies. And so keep your eye out for that. We'll do a press release on that soon. And that will, excuse me, contain quite a bit of detail and explanation. The typical, what's held back any advanced pellets, whether it's torrefied or steam exploded, has been the ability to be cost competitive against the sort of standard white pellet. And you have to offer a good price per gigajoule per unit of energy and have compelling characteristics to justify if you're going to have a higher price. Thus far, the technologies have not been able to deliver advanced pellets at competitive prices. We think that's likely to change as technologies improve. So keep an eye on that. I think advanced, so-called advanced pellets, whether they're torrefied or steam exploded, will be making inroads in the next few years.
Okay, great. So we have another question. Are the supply contracts with Vietnam short-term and therefore a lower price than Canada?
There is a lot of spot market activity in Vietnam. The Vietnamese pellet industry was built on the back of Korean demand, which is essentially not quite spot. They're 3 months, 6 month tenders, short-term agreements, and then those agreements are renewed several times a year, sometimes once a year, usually more frequently. But with that said, there are some Vietnam producers that are engaging in long-term offtake agreements with Japan, not with South Korea, but with Japan. So the market in Vietnam is maturing. And as South Korean demand kind of went flat and in fact fell somewhat, Vietnamese producers were looking for markets with more stability, and they turned to Japan.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. So what is the process for recognizing carbon credits using Canadian biomass in Japanese plants?
Quite honestly, I don't think we're qualified to answer that. Annette, do you have an answer for that? I don't think that policy's, the Japanese policy for recognizing carbon benefits is still evolving. Annette, do you have a comment on that?
No, only that there is, I'm not aware of any such program. There used to be a REC program, but that is a long time ago. Basically, it's all domestic feed-in tariff based or PPA based, and then with regard to sustainable fuels, there is, to my knowledge, but I'm not the expert on that, there is no REC program.
Yeah, and just really quickly, Ellen, obviously Japanese greenhouse gas emissions criteria and rules are also evolving. And so there probably will be some relationship between the greenhouse gas footprint of delivered pellets and their ability to be used or the pricing in the Japanese market, but that has not been determined yet.
Right. Okay, great. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for questions right now, but any questions that weren't answered, can send those along to the speakers later on. Those emails are right there.